There was a time when great famine came to the land of Germany, and at this time a poor woodcutter and his wife realized that they really had no food. And the wife argued with her husband and said, "We cannot feed our children. When we go to work tomorrow, let's take them with us. Let's take them deep into the wood. We have no choice but to leave them there." The husband argued with his wife, but eventually he agreed. Now the children, a boy named Hansel and a girl named Gretel, were laying awake in the next room and had heard what their parents had said. And they were terrified at the idea of being abandoned deep in the forest. But Hansel said to his sister, "Don't worry, I have a plan." So he quietly slipped out of the house and collected as many white pebbles as he could possibly find and filled his pockets with them. So the next day, when the children followed their parents along the path that led to the deepest part of the forest, Hansel simply dropped a trail of white pebbles along the path. And that day, as the children shared a morsel of bread, he reassured his sister that they would find their way back and all would be well. So when their parents didn't come to collect them, when the sun set and the moon began to rise, Hansel took his sister by the hand and followed the trail of the white pebbles back to their little house. And of course, my father was overjoyed to see them, for he was a man of a good heart. Time passed, and soon the family found themselves in the same situation. They were running out of food. They were hungry. And once more the mother put forward the suggestion that they had to abandon the children. And again Hansel and Gretel heard the conversation, but this time the parents had locked the door, and Hansel couldn't go out and find any more white pebbles. So the next day, when they followed their parents deep into the woods, Hansel left a trail of breadcrumbs, thinking, "We can follow these later. We can find our way home, and all will be well." But when the sun set and the moon began to rise, and the children tried to follow the trail of breadcrumbs back home, of course the birds had eaten all the bread, and they really were stuck, and they really were abandoned deep in the wood. So they wandered hither and they wandered thither, trying to find a way home or someone to help. And they came to a cottage deep in the woods, but it seemed to be made of bread. The windows seemed to be made of sugar. The house in this story is just bread. The gingerbread thing seems to be added later. The children were so hungry that they tore off handfuls of bread from the cottage walls and began to eat. And after some time, an old woman, older than anyone they had ever seen before, hobbled out of the cottage with her crutch, peering short-sightedly at the children and said, "Why are you eating the bread from my house?" And so Hansel and Gretel explained that they were just so hungry. And so the old woman, who of course was a witch, for who else would live alone deep in the woodland, invited them in and gave them a meal of pancakes, nuts, apples, and lots of honey. And then they slept that night in little beds with clean white sheets and thought they had found sanctuary. But the next day the old woman set Gretel to work, sweeping and cleaning. And as for Hansel, she took him outside and she placed him in a pen and locked the door so he couldn't get out. And she said to Gretel, "When your brother is fat enough, for he's too thin at the moment, I will place him in the oven, I will bake him, and I will eat him. Now carry on with your work, girl." Now Gretel passed a stick into her brother's pen. So every day when the old woman asked Hansel to put his fingers through the bars of the pen, he gave her the stick. And so the old woman thought that Hansel, despite how much he was eating, wasn't getting any fatter. And after some time, the old woman was so hungry, she thought, "I'm going to eat him anyway. I don't care how thin he is. I don't care if he's nothing but bone." So she said to Gretel, "Light the fire in the oven." So Gretel lit the fire. And the old woman said to her, "Climb inside the oven and check that the fire is well lit." For of course her intention really was to eat Gretel too. But Gretel said, "I don't know how to do it. How do I get inside the oven?" And the old woman said, "Oh, do I have to show you everything? Look, you just climb in like this." So the old woman threw her crutch away, clambered up inside the oven. "You see, Gretel, it's easy as anything. You just..." And that was as far as she got before Gretel closed the door. And so the old woman died inside the great oven. And Gretel, being overjoyed, ran out into the garden, undid the pen and released Hansel. And the two of them went through the old woman's cottage and found bags and bags of gold. And so they put as much gold as they could possibly carry in their pockets. And then they were just faced with the challenge of how to find their way out of the forest and back to their parents' home. So they wandered through the woods and they came to a river. And there on the river was a little white duck. And so Gretel asked the duck if she would carry them one at a time across the water, which the little white duck did. And then once they were across the water, it became clear to them where they were. And the path appeared before them through the woods, and so they found their way home. And their father was so relieved and so overjoyed and hugged them so tight, as if he would never let them go again. And he was even more overjoyed when they emptied out their pockets and showed him the gold. But the father was alone, for in the time that Hansel and Gretel had been away, their mother had passed into spirit. So that left the three of them with enough gold to feed themselves for the rest of their lives. So they did live happily ever after, because the famine that had gripped the kingdom came to an end. Of all the Grimm brothers stories, I think that was the one that I really didn't want to tell. But it is, if you asked anyone to name a Brothers Grimm story, that is probably the one that they would say. Obviously, we don't feel very comfortable with it, and it's the kind of thing that's used as evidence as to how badly the image of the women who were hanged as witches, how badly they were treated. It's a story that comes from desperation, from fear, from famine, from hunger. There we are. But it does have a happy ending. It's just interesting that in later versions of the story, of course, the mother becomes a stepmother, and that's kind of a bit more acceptable, I think, than the idea of a mother abandoning her own children. But did find a video on YouTube recently about the Black Death and about how that affected people. And there's a kind of line in there that there's evidence of incredible suffering, incredible famine, and parents abandoning children. Maybe it's even worse when you think that, yes, this is something that really did happen. There we are. Food for thought. Hope you enjoyed that story. Some of the other familiar Brothers Grimm stories are coming up, Cinderella and Little Red Riding Hood, but they're in their original forms, which are somewhat different from the tales as we know them. So do subscribe and stay tuned, and hold on for Cinderella, Red Riding Hood, and lots of other stories coming up. So enjoy.